Well, David, it's wonderful to see you. And the two of us have had conversations together, at least in my memory, since the mid 1960s, maybe even before 65. When you lived in Chicago, I was down there studying a bit and then hiding out in my garret and reading and coming and meeting you various places. And it was in a poignant time in the 60s in Chicago. It was certainly significant for me because of the kind of political upheaval in the world and what have you. And then we have talked since that time. It is a wonderful, wonderful thing to be given the blessing of long conversations over one's life. And I am so grateful for that. And as a result, so grateful that we can do this together a bit. I've admired your teaching for many years, the depth of your reading of the Hebrew Bible and of Greek texts, and the way in which you consider how these texts unfolded at the time and how they become a kind of foundation for us to think more deeply about our own world, our own struggles, and what have you. It also has been striking to me to think about how you are also a sailor. And in some ways, it seems to me that all people who read deeply are sailors, sometimes navigating the coasts, sometimes navigating difficult seas. One of the, I suppose, singular pleasures of our friendship is that I also knew your father, and he was a teacher of mine. And I knew your grandfather and had many wonderful conversations with him. So I think of both of them today as we walk into this. And it's a treasured lineage, in fact, that you are a part of. A grandson, a father, a grandfather, who also were deep readers of ancient texts and serious people considering the world that they'd been given and the institutions they were living in and trying to navigate those, and sometimes trying to navigate them as they also disintegrated and trying to remain focused on what might emerge from the difficulties of those disintegrations and those struggles. We've had a wide range of conversations over the decades, and every time you recommend a book to me, I order it and read it. And we often have a time to talk, but we've never had enough time to talk enough about any of them. And a year ago or so, you recommended David Feld's book.
Edward Feld.
Edward Feld's book, pardon me. I'm confused with all the Davids that we have here. Yeah, Edward Feld's book, the Book of Revolutions, the battles of priests, prophets, and kings that birthed the Torah. So today, we will consider Feld's book and what it unveils for us, both about the three codes that illuminate the biblical and Jewish world and shed light on our own time. And then I hope we will have several conversations following, each one devoted perhaps to one of these codes. So there are two things today that I hope we can walk into a little bit. One is I'd like you to introduce me to Feld's book I mean, I've read it, but your reading is so deep and broad in this area. So introduce me to this book of Revolutions and what's he up to here? And how does his reading of the text, in a way, shed light on your long history of studying the Torah and biblical studies in the Christian world as well? So Feld has a little four-piece to his book. It's from the Rabbi Samuel ben Meir, a 12th century rabbi, and it reads, "The simple meaning of the text is constantly unfolding." I'd like to begin there because it's one of the things that has always delighted me about your way of thinking and engaging texts, both ancient and modern. Your riveted way of how the text also speaks existentially to you and gives you a chance to think both about the ancient word and about the word that's present and emerging in our own time. So Feld's book, why did you pick it up?
Yeah, I mean, my most of my reading has been in narrative. And I'm like one of those seminary students when you had to read large passages and you got to Leviticus, for example. I just simply jumped over pieces of that thing.
Oh, yeah.
Partly because I didn't think they were relevant, which is I'm embarrassed to say that. This is relevant, this isn't relevant. Partly because there was really no help to engage these texts in a way that made sense to my faith. Well, that's not quite accurate. But mostly because they were just seemed inscrutable. They were another kind of text. And so I let go until I could pick up from now and then some help with learning how to read them. And so when Feld's book I saw the ad for it. This immediately, I mean, even the title of it made sense and was an invitation to enter into both, not just the reading of the legal text as legal text, but to set them in the context of history and also of the broader biblical landscape. So, he will end with that, which is what I really appreciated. So I want to very briefly describe what effect the book has had on me and what I think he has really been trying to do. Because he's talking about the nature of the biblical text itself, and that critical question about how to read it. And his assumption is, as all readers, is that the text will teach us how to read it. We can't read it the way we want to. We have to ask the text, how do you want to be read? Well, back in the mid-'60s, I was in your home and you read to me from Thomas Mann this astonishing exchange between Joseph in Egypt, Joseph, and I'd never actually heard anything like that. And that suddenly provided the groundswell of a midrashic mind that was there in me as a storytelling mind, as an interpretive mind, but never really given the permission to really open that up. And it's curious that at the end of Feld's book, he will return to Midrash as a process of reading, lively, full of debate, full of imagination, which is the heart of the matter here. And a recognition that, in fact, it's the text that is encouraging this. The text is wanting to be, well, Buber says it, Martin Buber says it this way, it really is a dialogue between heaven and earth, and it really demands that we enter into the dialogue. So that's what I know about. And the literary scholars like Robert Alter would have spent lots of really creative time, have looked into the artful quality of narrative. And I still met the legal texts more. How does that come into this dialogue? So that's what Feld opens up, and I think his primary aim is to show that there is not unanimity. We know that from the literary scholars. We know that from our own reading. The lack, I mean, and not only is there a lack of unanimity, there's often contradictions, and that these contradictions are exposed by the layers of editing that have taken place over a thousand years. That they not only preserve the distinctions between these codes, as we'll get into, but they set them side by side often, juxtaposed, for the very purpose of raising the questions. There's the heart of Midrash. Midrash means to ask. It is to inquire. And so the reading of these texts is asking us to inquire of their uniqueness, the times in which they're embedded, the possibilities for why they were revised, how they were revised, and to open us up to those energies in a faith community that are varied and plural. That's really, I think, that's what he's really after, is for us to see that there isn't homogeneity, there's in fact heterogeneity, or there's it's a multiple text, all preserved in its multiplicity. So right before us are these codes, which are the heartbeat of social practice and religious rites, that are not the same and are the same. So we see them in layers, and we see their intentions, and then it gives us an intimation for the complexity of our own day and how these things are working out, particularly right now. I mean, as many of the reviewers of Feld have been pointing toward, the great crisis within Israel around the ultra-Orthodox definition of who a Jew is and what Jews should do, but also within our own large church community, and in particular within my own small denomination of the Covenant Church, which I have really in many ways left, or I've felt have left me, because they've opted for one code over recognition that all codes coexist, and the kind of importance of how that builds strength, that diversity is essential to a living faith. He comes to that point at the end, but he leads us through the history of this process almost as historical drama. And he brings in these great characters of prophets and kings and moments and fundamentally traumas that give rise to this engaged relationship with the text that is there, and recreates it and then imagines it again and turns it over like geological forces that finally get revealed in a text, that is not homogenized. It's just what it is. So that's said too much already, perhaps, but
not at all. Not at all. Two things about that. I'd like you to unwrap a little bit what you mean, and to some extent your experience, and perhaps it's also there with Feld's consideration. What you mean by a text shows us how to read itself. That so often in your and my background, our church background, so many people, although this was not really true about your father or grandfather, it seems to me, nor for mine, so often the text was going, people went to the text to mine it for something. And to mine it for something that they already had a framework for, an understanding of, a system. The theological cathedrals and maybe it's not even right to call them cathedrals in our particular case, because they were relatively small, meeting houses, became a prison, and you interpreted the whole text through that. So say a little bit more about your experience of realizing. You mentioned the struggle around this when you were studying in the seminary and what have you, and skipped over Leviticus. I remember skipping over it too a number of times, because, like you said, it seemed from some another place, and I couldn't locate it, and it seemed hyper moralistic, and I just didn't want to touch it. But say a little bit more about this question of how the text, if you seek, as Buber so beautifully articulates, if you seek to open yourself to hear it.
Yeah.
Hear it not at the boundaries of your mind, where things are certain and made up, but hear it in the depth of your mind and heart and experience. And then all of a sudden it becomes a dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah, and here's where I think our mutual traditions have been a place of grounding for our reading, where on a very simple level, lay people decided that they could read the text on their own. They didn't need to be told what it was. And of course, that's one of that was that was a threat. Yeah. That was a threat to people who wanted to say the Bible says this. And on the other side, when you get through Feld's book, particularly with the law, you can't say the Bible says this. The Bible says this, and it says this, and it says this. And so even if you say the Bible says this, you're aware that the Bible is also saying this or that. That's an entirely different approach to the Bible. We don't approach it as a uniform, completed, but we read it as a development of the religious experience in some kind of form. And also not only in written, the oral law accompanied the written law at the same time. So there was always interpretation along the written. So it's easier in narrative, as Robert Alter talks about, to fine-tune the binoculars to see, oh, this word is repeated over and over again within this even small pericope. We're a little hobbled because English, which does not like repetition, used all sorts of synonyms, which obliterated the repetition that was very obvious in the Hebrew text. And here I want to highlight the work of Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig's tremendous gift to the literary world by translating the Hebrew Bible into German, trying to retain those kind of literary signposts. So once they're there, it's like, oh, why is this repeated over and over again? And then we realize that repetition, particularly in the oral tradition, is critical. In a literary sort of way, it allows the writer to say, this is what I'm really talking about, without telling you this is what I'm really talking about. So it's like, I have a dream speech by King. He doesn't have to tell you, this is my point. You simply get the point because it's a memnotic quality that people like Auerbach and others have noticed. Our ears are tuned to this, while our eyes are tuned to this. So when we walk into a text that has now been translated by Everett Fox from Buber and Rosenzweig work into English, which is a marvelous translation. It is unfamiliar, which I think is the key to being able to be open to enter into a dialogue. It's like you and I mean, I know you well, but if I know what you're going to say next, then this will not be dialogue.
Yeah.
And so the strangeness of it the kind of unfamiliarity of it, the constant repeating of words, because Hebrew is so its vocabulary is vastly minimal compared to English. But it conveys an enormous amount of meaning because the language is descriptive and not definitive. I mean, it can be definitive, but mostly it's painting a picture, and it's encouraged. It has constellations of meaning. So just that alone, recognizing repetition, begins to point us into the play toward what the text is wanting us to just simply notice and then ponder that. For example, when Jacob is running away because Esau wants to kill him, he goes to a place and he lays down in that place and he sets up stones in that place. And this is Makom, Makom, Makom. And then he wakes up and he says, he wakes up in that place from the dream and says, God is in this place. And I didn't know. So they call the place Bethel, simply the house of God.
Yeah.
We will miss this text if we think it's about something other than place.
Yeah.
And so we're being taught how to read by following along. And of course, there's many more. There's literary features of the text that are replete, particularly, for example, in the Psalms, in poetic parallelism and all of the above. And by the way, I just want to say that more and more gospel writers are saying that the early parts of the genesis of these texts is also teaching readers to read, how to read along. So we start out not knowing, and we start out with, again, Buber's, we should approach a text as if we've never read it before.
How to read along, and how to read into, and how to have yourself read by the text.
Yeah, absolutely. There's absolutely, that's vital.
And you mentioned the Jacob text, and the part of it that also so stood out for me when I read it in the Fox translation was both in the narrative that you cite, as well as in the narrative a little later when he decides he has to, in the end, meet his brother, and the repetition of the word face.
Yeah.
In that is just haunting.
Yeah.
You read it, and I think of the way in which the face of God is talked about in the Hebrew Bible, and also in liturgy. I think of the great benediction. My father sometimes worked late at night and would come home from his carpenter work, and we were in bed as children, and he would come up and he wouldn't wake me up. I don't recall that, but I must have sort of come awake a few times, and he would place his hands, sometimes I think just close to my head, and pray the great benediction. May God bless you and keep you. May God make his countenance to shine upon you. Countenance, face, countenance. It is a way, and Buber is so brilliant at this, it is a way of saying, when you're drawn into the presence, not into the project, not into the presumptions, not into what you presume, but into the presence. And we see it with Jacob and Esau.
Yeah. Yeah.
We see it with Jacob and Esau. Yeah. It's transformative.
Yep.
It makes the world new.
Yep. Can I pause you a minute?
Please.
Can you please pause?
Yeah. I also, David, I don't know if I first heard it from you, or it certainly is something that I've thought of over the years. And when I've been teaching in my little way, Christians made note of it. One of the curiosities for, at least for most Christians, one of the curiosities about the way in which Jews read the Bible, this issue of repetition that you mentioned, that Buber rings the changes on. Also his comment that the Bible is never read in silence. It's always read out loud. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It needs to come into your ear. And it's also read in community. The Bible isn't written as a normal text as we understand it in the modern world. It's written in a community, for a community, and can only be understood within the context of the community. These are extraordinary matters for us to ponder. The one that I wanted to mention is, and it relates to your comment about how the Bible is not a finished text. There is no end to the Word of God. It's one of my ways of putting that. And is that if Jews, and we see this sort of visually in the Talmud, if there are distinct interpretations of a text, the Jewish formula is keep both. Even if one of them doesn't make any sense to you now, it might make sense in 200 years or in a century. Keep both. So when you speak of Midrash, I mean, there's a sense, is there not, that the whole of the biblical text is a story told about a story told about a story. It's a variety of ways of coming at something. And what it's coming at, I suppose, or at least my prejudice would say, it's always coming at two things. One is the notion of Adonai. Who do you say that I am? And the other is the notion of what it means to be human in the face of what's unfolding. And that these are dancing together and always dancing together. So I have another kind of, I suppose, prejudgment, given my very modest study of the history of religions and other forms of sacred text and wisdom text. One of the things that seems vivid to me about the biblical text is that it, when you read it large, it, in a way, and I want to know if you see it this way or how you would engage this, it strikes me as sanctifying the act of interpretation. That is, sanctifying the act that says, this is not simply about something that can be bounded by the past. It is that, but it is also a revelation, a revealing, a unveiling, which you now hear in the present.
Yeah.
And you don't need to react to it. You don't need to make something out of it. You need to respond.
Yeah. I mean, Buber will write, when we read the text, when we are engaged with the text, we are revealed to ourselves and cannot speak about it other than as revelation. So this is not a fancy thing that's going on just within the person. It is actually a living dialogue, which is how, I can only know myself by being confirmed by another. And so it's not something I come up with on my own. And that's the genius of the text. I mean, and it really is what Feld is pointing to in a new way for me, because we're using these kinds of almost like equations, and I heard you say this. When we read a text, we're being read by the text. That's just happens. That's the nature of reading. That's what it means to be in the world. We do little about that because we've split up for all sorts of reasons. We're not very conscious of that. But the other equation is from James Sanders, the great writer on hermeneutics, is that whenever we're reading a text, the implicit question is, who am I, and what am I to do? And as you said, in terms of the reading and community, who are we and what are we to do? These are elemental questions. And it's at the heart of what Feld is speaking about, because we're talking about codes. I mean, when we read narrative, we bring the same question. When we read the codes in terms of regulation of life and of our social relationships and that, it's more explicit, but the question is still the same. And our back and forth with what it is, here's what you should do. Well, okay, now, I should do it because you say I should do it. I should do it this way because I'm an Israelite, or because I'm those are the questions that are just woven throughout the entire Hebrew text. And I would say mostly Torah in that sense, because there's a lot of texts that come, and particularly afterwards, that are just really do want to find some kind of uniformity. Can't we just take something from each of the codes and blend them together so we can agree? And the way the Torah was written was clearly to say, no, you can't do that.
But that's
You can
also,
enter into it. Pardon me?
But that's also a revelation, isn't it? That occurs, that in other texts, that kind of blending occurs. That reveals something to us. It says, look out for this.
Yeah.
This has happened over and over again, and look where it leads.
Yeah.
So
Precisely.
that too is a revelation. I sometimes say, I'm happy to say that all the scripture is revelation, but revelation about what?
Yeah.
It has to be a revelation which is also about the way in which human beings miss the mark, the way in which we turn things into something which represents our tribe, our self-interest, our passions, and destroy life. So in a sense, there are these two golden strands, it seems to be, coming through the scriptures, which is the strand about that we see depicted so beautifully in Abraham when he begins to wonder, when he has that, you may have taught me that word, when he has that inkling, there is something above the gods. There's something above sacralities. There's something above my tribal world, something above my ideological world, something above even my intimate relationships. And begins to take that journey. So,
and I think the other piece that Feld is very good at, particularly, and we'll look at this perhaps first with the covenant code of the three: covenant code, Deuteronomic code, and holiness code, is, first of all, also we should be reading this text in the context of being written and rewritten and edited over centuries. So history is, as Langdon Gilkey says, is the great detergent of ideology. So we see various versions of, for example, the life of David. Chronicles cleans him up quite a bit. But there's David in all of his glory, before us, which is itself a fascinating grasp on writers who intend to show the importance of a king. So that, and I'll use this as an introduction to the codes. There's this natural movement of Israel from the Exodus, which no doubt happened in some form. resettling land where there are already people. And we have stories of conquest and, frankly, genocide and all of that, and destruction. But probably it was like all migrations. This is what my father taught me. Migration is the normal state of affairs.
Yeah.
And as soon as you land someplace, somebody else is trying to come in, and you know that exhibits all sorts of responses, which we see in the codes. And so Israel is coming into the land. There's already codes, you know, including some of the old Hammurabi codes, and because people have been working out social relationships and how to live with each other, you know, since the beginning. And Israel accepts some of that. There's a lot of the codes, particularly in the covenant code, that is very similar to normal Near Eastern codes that are there. And so it's a very natural process. Alongside of that, there's a kind of an identity among these tribes that is focused on the kind of exclusive worship of Adonai. And yet, what we see is all sorts of tendencies when you're moving into another culture, for there to be what we would call today interfaith dialogue, and even intermarriage. People fall in love, and now we've got two different codes living in the same family, and we know all about that in the modern world too. You know?
Yeah.
And some people, you know, absolutely think that should be forbidden, because in order to keep everything pure and clean, and particularly clear. But the nature of life is such that it moves, and it entwines itself in the places where it is. It embodies itself, and it gets changed. The old adage, you know, whatever you touch, you change. Whatever you change changes you. It's why it's such a marvelous. It's a part of all of nature, but it's also a part of the human experience. So now there's codes that are saying, okay, well, we want to create some distinction here, because there are some sense in our relationship with Adonai that we need to see is particular to us. And we'll notice this when we begin to compare how they approach it. But so that itself indicates a movement through time and through various different kinds of conditions of relationship and different historical moments that will feed back, you know, the concerns of a people.
So the covenant code is what we see at Sinai?
Well, what happened there is clearly what happened. We don't know. And there are at least 3 or 4 different versions of what happened at Sinai in the biblical text. And that these are all kept also indicates the importance in the imagination. I think you've taught me this more than anything. The role of the religious imagination is tantamount, but the imagination is varied because events are varied, and because often these things are written down hundreds of years after they happen. There is something that happens at Sinai that is so important to that imagination that the Deuteronomic code, written, you know, probably 600 years afterwards, is still assigned to the authorship is assigned to Moses. There's one version in which Moses goes up and down. Now here's a repetitive pattern. In the 19th chapter of Exodus, Moses goes up, comes down, goes up, goes down. It's the repeated. Moses goes up, Moses comes down. And immediately, if we just take that repetition into account, we recognize that this is a negotiation. Up and down, talks to the people, goes up. We have to imagine that Moses is arguing it, because at least in the narrative, he's splendid at that. You know. Another time, it's Adonai who shows up on the mountain and simply tells the people. Another time, the 70 go up. There's a kind of representative government that goes up. It's all an exchange, but the revelation is not is never really top down. It is a entering into a mutual dialogue around which a covenant, a living covenant, can be fashioned. So it's not like a product is given, it's like a relationship is established.
Right.
And this becomes really important in Feld's work, particularly when we get to the last of the codes, because it's not we're handed something, we're invited into. The invitation is to enter into this dialogue, even with the codes that are promulgated, for us to follow. But nonetheless, there it is. I mean, there's a great midrash in which Moses is ushered into the Talmud Torah, where Rabbi Akiva is holding forth, and Akiva is doing midrash on all the little jots and tittles, as Jesus would talk about sometimes. It's complicated and beyond comprehension for most mortal minds, except Akiva's. And Moses looks at Ishmael and says, I don't know what he's talking about. And Akiva says, everything I learned today, and I'm teaching you, I learned from Moshe Rabbeinu. So what comes through that relationship, and I think that relationship is as important as whatever is coming down from the mountain, whatever is worked out in the Moab, in the Midbar, in the wilderness, is all part of what makes this a living process of engagement.
So when we speak of covenant, I've often made the little note that covenant is about a spousal relationship.
Yeah.
It's not about a legal relationship.
Right.
We tend to read it as a legal relationship, or many religious people do. But as you beautifully described it in the different narratives about this is about establishing a kind of relationship which has communion in it and has running after other things in it and coming back into communion again. So what is the second code? It's the covenant code.
The code that follows the covenant code is, and by the way, that covenant code is not in the Exodus version of the Ten Commandments, which isn't, the word commandment isn't in that it isn't in that text anyway. In Exodus 20, it's devarim, which is words or instruction. So it's the 10 words, the 10 instructions, and that always drives conservatives crazy. But it's just not there in the text. In the second code, which comes up after the trauma of the loss of the 10 tribes by the Assyrian invasion in 722, some 500 years afterwards, maybe 400 years afterwards, when those 10 tribes are gone, there is a rewriting of the so-called law, and actually most of the history. And there's this great story where Josiah, in about 640, says, "Oh, there's a scroll here." And Feld is very good about this. It's like it just appears. We don't know where it's been, but look, it's written by Moses, and it has another version of the 10 sayings, and then rewrites much of the codes. But it has these differences about it that express the fear and the attempt to fix the problem that led to the dissolution of the northern kingdom. And then finally, when wasn't more than 150 years later that the Babylonians came and took out the southern kingdom. So I have this sense, even from reading Feld, It's like in the Deuteronomic Code and the Josiah reforms. It's like saying we got to really do this now. Everybody's got to be serious about this code, because if we're not serious about this code, we won't live in this land. It'll be taken away from us. Because that's what happened. That's their explanation, which is curious given the other narratives, David. I know we're, but can I give you an example?
Yeah, please.
So in the Deuteronomic rewriting of history, which is most likely Joshua and Judges and First and Second Kings, story of the kings, the end of the book of Judges, the tribe of Benjamin is nearly wiped out. The intertribal warfare during this whole period, where there's supposedly a code, is unbelievably violent and vicious, so that at the very end of the book of Judges, it says, in those days, everybody did what was right in their own eyes.
Yeah.
There was no king.
Yeah.
Well, everybody did what was right in their own eyes is not, it suggests there is no code that's active.
Yeah.
People decide on their own. And the other implication is that if you had a king, then you could enforce it. So in my mind, and the way I'm reading Feld, the history of Israel from this point on is to find a king. This is what the people want, even though Samuel says, I don't think you want this. This is what's going to happen. But they decide they want it. So we get Saul, and there's all of that fabulous narrative. And then we come to David, who's the shining star, the center of a dynasty around which we even root Jesus as part of that lineage. And what does he do? He commits adultery. He secretly creates, has somebody murdered. He has a cover up and all of that. All those codes. And now what? And yet he's kept as king, which is a great question that the rabbis ponder. Some of them try to ponder it by overlooking what he did. Some of them, like even today, will talk about the ex-president as a strong man that God can use anyway, even though he's morally corrupt. But that's a shallow understanding of the nature of the ambiguity of the human experience, which is present in the narrative. And at the same time, we can see how the codes are wrapped around this. Josiah wants people to be faithful, wants them to follow, is upping the ante, is making he's differentiating Israelites from non-Israelites. You treat the sojourner differently. And yet in the original covenant code, there's a kind of an egalitarianism about that that's really quite stunning, given the way other empires and kingdoms have operated. And this seems to be some kind of a strain of that covenant relationship with Adonai that is in the heart of that covenant, even with the specific rules that they're talking about. You can't, and that gets played out in the ongoing narrative. What's the heart of it? And that's what the prophets are after. What's at the heart of what this relationship is about. And so what should we do if we're in that relationship? How should we behave toward each other and toward others?
So the covenant code, just give me a little summary so I can hang on to this of the three codes and the sort of context in which they emerge. Just do them in a row, the three of them.
The covenant code is a slow assimilation and exploration of the identity of Israel with the extant codes that they're entering in the land that they're entering and the peoples they're entering with. And the Deuteronomic Code comes much later, following the destruction of the Northern Kingdom, and is a reaction to that trauma. And the final code, the Holiness Code, is a reaction and one response. I have to always say that, not the. There is no the response. Or one response to the loss of the temple and to the trauma that this happened again. And how do we answer the question, who am I, when there is no temple?
Yeah.
And when there's no political power? And that Feld seems to suggest creates an opening for reimagining the nature of the community. Not to go back to the way it was and try again, but to reimagine what that community looks like. And then he holds those in tension, as we know, what we really want to achieve and what we're able to achieve feels very much like King's beloved community. We can see it now more clearly because we know how we got here. Now, what will it take for us to get that? And then, I would say it becomes much more a matter not of obedience, but a matter of the heart. Where does our identity lie and what are we to do? So covenant is entering into the land for that hundreds of years. The Deuteronomic Code is a response to the laws of the Northern Kingdom. And the Holiness Code, which begins to reimagine a return to Israel after the exile, but fundamentally reimagines the definition of what Judaism is. As you so beautifully said earlier, some have said the loss of the temple is an into study, because the word avodah, to study in rabbinic Hebrew, is the same as the word avodah for going to the temple sacrifice. Is that where once the word became flesh in the temple, now the flesh has become word.
Yeah.
And we play with that, of course, in the imagination within the Christian stories powerfully. I should say, so if readers want to start reading the Covenant Code, it really begins in Exodus 21. Feld will say, and most scholars will say, people will, of course, argue about this, but the giving of the law in Exodus 20 is probably part of the Holiness Code rewriting. So this is what's so fascinating about how these texts exist. So we have the Covenant Code beginning in Exodus 21. We have the Deuteronomic Code in large portions of Numbers and Leviticus, but the Holiness Codes then begins right at Leviticus 19. It's right in there. That's why I mean by these are sitting side by side. And unless we're really paying attention to know how to look for these signposts, it's hard to see. So
yeah, that's
Exodus 21,
nicely.
most of Deuteronomy,
right,
and Leviticus, and then Leviticus 19.
Yeah.
On.
Yeah. In our own kind of Christian world and in the kind of politics of religion in our part of the world, it has so often been curious to me, and this really highlights it with what you've said, that you have judges in the American South which want to chisel the Ten Commandments into granite and put them up in their courthouse. And every time I see this, I wonder, why wouldn't you chisel the Beatitudes in the granite and put that up in the courthouse? And what you have pointed out is that the notion of covenant itself isn't what they think law is.
Yeah.
It's instruction.
Yeah.
It's a spousal relationship.
Yeah.
It expresses an aspiration.
Yeah.
And that aspiration struggles with whatever is given in history to people. Yeah. And what you've laid out here, what Feld is doing, is showing these great moments of intense reconsideration in light of what you call trauma.
Yeah.
And that's something we will have to pay attention to as we continue our conversations. These traumas, which in a sense require a reconsideration.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that part of that reconsideration is a remembering. And I'm so struck with the notion that remembering is not recall. It's entering into a living community again, becoming a member of something that's ongoing and that is moving, that is engaging what is unfolding, as opposed to an act of nostalgia.
Yeah, absolutely.
My friend and colleague now of blessed memory, who is at OISE, University of Toronto, and Roger Simon, and asked me to join him in a project he had in mind associated with the Jewish ghettos during the Holocaust. He did much of his work on public memory. How is it we remember traumas in the public sphere? So he'd had graduate students over 30 years of fine teaching, doing work on the murder of the women at the Polytechnic in Montreal, on the Sandinistas, on Fidel Castro. He had done some early work on Holocaust museums and had then turned away from that. And out of this consideration, he drew from that what I found a marvelous lesson. He said that it is not good enough to simply recall or remember, or to recall. That is often simply re-traumatizing. It often just fixes you again in the trauma that was there. We need to, and his term was, we need to remember well. And when we remember well, it is not re-traumatizing. It is an integrative act. It is an act of, as you expressed it with Feld's word and the holiness code. Well, now that the temple is gone, now that that place where we would gather on the Day of Atonement, that only day of the year, when the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, that only day of the year when the name of Adonai could be uttered, that place is gone.
Yeah.
Is it gone? Has it moved? Does Adonai not exist? Does the temple not exist? Does the place of the holy not exist? Ah, the holiness code.
Yeah. There's a great moment because, these codes have each of their own prophets.
Yeah.
But, at the end, in the loss of the temple, which will be another major trauma in 70 CE for Jews.
Yeah.
There's this line in Isaiah, you have heard that it was said that the temple is the footstool of the Lord. But I say, the earth is the footstool.
Yeah.
Well, that goes right to the point. Now we're talking about an entirely different cosmos.
Yeah. Well, David, that's lovely. I just wanted to ring the changes on one thing you said, because it reminds me of this whole issue of reading. You talked just briefly about how it is dangerous to read the text as if it was familiar. That is, on the one hand, there's this repetition. On the other hand, there's this attempt to guard against familiarity. And I've thought about, our time in Sunday school and other places where we are encouraged to memorize text. But it's interesting to me that somebody like Maximus the Confessor, the great Eastern Christian thinker, who I am convinced spent time with rabbis. There's no evidence of this, but I cannot imagine how he could have written the way he did. without having spent time with rabbis or with rabbinical literature of some sort or another. He also makes this point that you need to divest yourself of what you think about the text.
Yep.
You need to go through this kenosis so you can hear and so you can be heard by the text.
Yep. Yep.
So we will walk into the covenant code with you next time.
Okay.
Thanks so much, David.
It's been a great pleasure. Always a pleasure, David. Thank you.
I'll stop recording.